welcome to Games is Lit 101. Last week we talked about adaptation, what it is, how it works, and why it's actually pretty interesting and important. This week, it's time to get down into the details of how it relates to video games. There have been quite a few attempts to make movies based on video games, and the attempts so far have mostly been... okay, how to put this lightly? Intoxicated gorillas armed with quill pens and disposable cameras in an empty room could have created better and more faithful movie adaptations. Yes, it's a well-known fact that movies based on video games are almost always terrible, which is pretty unfortunate. For every one great adaptation we have out there, there are just a ton of hey, no, not again. Yeah, that's right, get out of here. I can't tell you how many movie reviews I've seen that basically come down to, well, the story is terrible, but what do you expect? It's based on a video game. And that's really unfortunate. You know, our medium is not being represented well to those outside of it. Which means that these movies aren't just sucking in a vacuum. They're actively doing harm to our medium and its cultural perception. And that really sucks. So why is that? And how could it be better? We're going to rule out the idea that video games are more difficult to adapt because of interactivity. I mean, that's certainly true of some games. Mass Effect, for instance, would be virtually impossible, but the majority of games do actually tell a fairly linear story. And even for those that don't, there's nothing stopping us from making indirect adaptations, new stories in the same setting. Another idea that we'll just get out of the way right now is that we can't make a direct adaptation of a video game story in another medium. I actually hear this one a lot, but I have no idea where it came from. There's no reason why we couldn't retell a video game story in another medium. And I don't think anyone would claim that the biggest problem with video game adaptations thus far is that they've been too faithful. One could point to a lot of issues with most of these movies, of course. There is certainly no shortage of problems, but when it comes down to it, the overarching problem here is a bit simpler than that, I think. In fact, Jordan Mechner pretty much summed it all up in an interview about the Prince of Persia movie, when he said, "Rather than do a straight beat-for-beat adaptation of the new video game, we're taking some cool elements from the game and using them to craft a new story, much as Pirates did with the theme park ride." Within that one sentence, I believe, is the whole problem with most attempts to adapt video games into other mediums like movies. Pirates of the Caribbean is a great ride. It's a ton of fun, but it is a ride. It doesn't have a story, it just shows you a whole bunch of really cool pirate-themed props and scenarios. The only kind of adaptation you can do with something like that is a conceptual adaptation, because concepts are all that a ride like that has to offer. Sands of Time, the game, is a story. It has a 3-act structure, character arcs, and themes of adulthood and responsibility. The movie treated it like a theme park ride. It picked a few surface elements, the prince, magical sands, princess, evil vizier, and athletic combat, and completely did its own thing with them. And that's why, despite sucking a lot less than most game-to-film adaptations, Sands of Time failed terribly as an adaptation. It only took the most basic of surface elements from its namesake, not because it was lazy or terrible, but because it seemed to think those surface elements were all the game had to offer. It's just a toy that lets you pretend to be a prince that jumps around and saves the world from evil sand powers. Look at most video game adaptations and you'll see the same thing. They took the cool action, or the zombies, or whatever the heck UA Bowl does, but they didn't actually treat the game as a story to be adapted and told in another medium. Their process of adaptation is more like they're adapting toys than works of narrative art, and the result is something far worse than a lot of things that actually are based on toys. But it's not all bad. As you might expect, Japan's been at this as well, and they've done a much better job. In fact, you might be surprised at just how many incredible anime series are actually based on video games, like Clannad, Fate Stay Night, and Steins Gate. They've even done a good job with movies, like the awesome Professor Layton movie, the gorgeous Final Fantasy VII sequel, Advent Children, and even the imperfect but still interesting live-action Phoenix Wright movie. Heck, they made a children's film based on Animal Crossing, and even it wasn't terrible. Kind of weird and pointless, but still better than almost everything Hollywood's churned out so far based on video games. That said, Japan generally has a better track record of respecting new media as art, so that's not too surprising. There have also been a lot of books based on video games, and they have a bit of a better track record. None of them are masterpieces or anything, at least not as far as I've read, but many are at least interesting and often pretty well-written explorations of the characters and worlds of the games they're based on. Honestly, the sad thing is that the best source I've found for quality adaptations of video games so far is fan fiction. Now hold on, I know that's kind of hard to believe, and it's true that the majority of fan fiction is pretty terrible, but that's only because there's literally no barrier of entry. Literally anyone can write fan fiction, but that doesn't mean that there aren't good writers, and good writers, of course, write good things, fan fiction or no. When it comes down to it, I have read fan fiction that does a better job adapting its source material than any video game movie I've seen. And I think that fact makes the solution quite clear. Obviously, a good video game adaptation is going to require a good deal of knowledge of the medium that we're adapting the game into, but it requires one other very important thing as well. Actual, legitimate respect for video games as an artistic medium as well as the specific game being adapted. And not just respect as a fun toy or a silly pastime, but as a work of art, a story to be retold in a new way. Fanfiction writers, even the worst ones, are writing what they write because they have a genuine interest in the world and the characters presented by the source material. They respect it. Most of them don't have the skill to back it up, of course, but that doesn't make that respect any less important. There are a number of efforts going on right now, including Blizzard's own World of Warcraft movie and Ubisoft's attempts to maintain a lot of creative control over the movies based on their video games, that I think are a pretty decent step in the right direction. When it comes down to it, when we can look forward to a video game movie with excitement and anticipation instead of cynicism, it's going to be because the people making it are making it out of an actual respect for the video game they're adapting as a work of narrative art, not just as a digital toy. So do you agree? What do you think it'll take for us to get out of this rut we're in and get some good video game adaptations out there? Go ahead and share any ideas you have down in the comments. Next week, we wrap up our 3-part series on adaptation by turning the tables on this scenario and talking about video games that are based on stories from other mediums. So, until then, class dismissed.